Welcome back to week 2. In this video, we'll cover Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, and the beginning of the psychoanalytic approach to studying personality. Sigmund Freud was born in the 1850s in Austria and was trained as a neurologist in young adulthood. He would eventually go on to become one of the most famous individuals in the field of psychology, despite the fact that he was not trained as a psychologist. His method of psychoanalysis, which he completed in the late 1800s, was the first formal attempt at studying and defining personality from a psychological or neurological perspective. And his theory is still quite famous today, despite the fact that research doesn't support some of its components. So we'll learn a little bit more about his life and his theory in this lecture before we move on to Carl Jung. Freud's parents were originally from Ukraine, and both of his parents were Jewish. That is important because later in life, just before Freud's death, he was forced to flee the region as the Nazi regime began to take over Germany. As an adult, Freud said that he felt hostility and anger toward his father because his father was so strict with Freud. He also says that he felt a passionate sexual attraction to his mother, who he described as being extremely loving. In 1884, Freud published an article about the benefits of using cocaine with his patients. He did not cover the disadvantages because he himself had not yet developed an addiction. It wasn't until later in life that the addiction became more apparent to him and that he finally admitted he might have a problem. Freud opened his clinical practice in 1886 and started seeing his own patients. This is when he began to experiment with different methods, trying to figure out what worked best. By 1896, we can see in his writings that he had developed what he called psychoanalysis. Throughout Freud's life, he had relatively negative attitudes about sex. And in his own marriage, he sometimes struggled with the act. He used dream analysis to try to figure out why he had headaches, stomach aches, why he had problems with indigestion, why he was weak, why he was always worrying. His analysis of his symptoms eventually led him to diagnose himself as having what he called anxiety neurosis. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, Freud published some of his earliest work and attracted a group of disciples, including Carl Jung and Alfred Adler. He reached the height of his career in the 1920s and 1930s, just before Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime began to change things in Germany. By 1938, Freud and his family felt threatened by the changing circumstances and decided to move to the United Kingdom. A year later, Freud died from mouth cancer, although there are reports that he asked his private physician to give him a lethal dose of morphine just to make the pain stop. According to Freud, our biological needs, like hunger, thirst, sleep, avoiding danger, these biological needs create tension within us. This tension then motivates us to reduce the tension and restore balance. The energy that used to satisfy our biological needs can be displaced. And when the energy is displaced, it forms our personality. According to Freud, personality included things like our interests, our preferences for different things in our environment, and our attitudes about ourselves and about the world around us. instincts were an important part of Freud's theory. He defined them a little bit differently than we define them today. He suggested instincts are the basic building blocks, the basic components of personality. And instincts are essentially the representation, the mental representation of the physiological needs that we are constantly trying to fulfill. These mental representations then serve as the number one source of energy for motivating our behavior and making sure that we satisfy the needs that we're trying to satisfy. Freud proposed two different types of instincts. The life instincts are those things that motivate us to satisfy needs for sex, food, water, air. The energy that is then created by this drive, this motivation, is what Freud called the libido. The libido is the energy, the specific psychological energy that then drives humans to seek things that make them happy and make them feel good beyond food, sleep, air. Cathexis is the term that Freud used to describe the process of investing your energy into an object or a person. Death instincts, on the other hand, motivate us to destroy and hurt ourselves. Freud said that aggressive behavior is actually the wish to die, part of the death instincts, turned against other people. And this aggressive drive compels us to hurt other people. Freud divided personality into three different levels and said personality is a lot like an iceberg. The conscious is the part of personality that we're aware of. It's the mental processes that are currently in our awareness. The unconscious are those things that are hidden and not explicitly available to us. The unconscious, according to Freud, is a major driving force between all of our behaviors. He really popularized the term unconscious and emphasized its importance to human behavior and thought processes. The preconscious contains the mental processes that we're not aware of yet, but that if we wanted to rely on those processes, we could quickly bring them into awareness and rely on them in the existing situation. The id is the storehouse for all of our instincts, and it corresponds to the unconscious. The id supplies all of the energy for both the ego and the superego. And the id's main goal is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. The id has no awareness of reality and attempts to satisfy our needs through reflexes and childlike thinking. And what do I mean by childlike thinking? I'm talking about things like, I want ice cream, so I'm going to get ice cream. I want to do this right now, so I'm going to do it right now. The ego, according to Freud, is the rational part of our personality. Its goal is to put some constraints on the demands of the id and help balance those demands with the reality of the situation. The ego does this by satisfying needs through rational and mature thought processes. Back to our ice cream example, the ego says to the id that wants ice cream, you can have ice cream later, you can't have it right now because you're in the middle of a lecture. The ego, according to Freud, is the rational part of our personality. Its goal is to put some constraints on the demands of the id while also allowing us to satisfy some of our needs. The ego decides how our id instincts are expressed. Going back to the ice cream example, I want ice cream right now, so I'm going to get ice cream right now. That is what the id would say. The ego would then say to the id, okay, that's fine, you want ice cream, I get it, but you are right in the middle of a lecture, so you can't have it right now. You can have ice cream later. That is the rational part of our personality, sort of trying to keep the childlike, animal-like instincts at bay so that we can survive in reality. The superego is the moral part of our personality. It operates mostly at the preconscious level, below awareness, but not completely hidden from awareness. The superego, like the id, is relentless. It is a never-ending drive to be morally appropriate in all situations. The superego represents the moral and ethical values that we learned in childhood. The conscience is the behaviors for which we were punished in childhood. The ego ideal are those behaviors that we were praised for in childhood. Let's look at a quick example to illustrate these three different structures of the personality according to Freud. A college student would like to invite two of their attractive friends out on the same date. This desire involves the id because it is the most basic desire. This is what the human wants. The human wants a date with two people. However, the college student knows that using two friends for one date would likely create some problems. This acknowledgement involves the ego. The ego is the rational part of our personality. In this example, the ego recognizes that this probably wouldn't work in reality. Furthermore, the student also knows that this behavior might violate social norms. This involves the superego, the moral part of our personality. Freud also wrote about anxiety. He defined anxiety as a fear of something in our environment. He wrote about three different types of fear. Anxiety related to tangible dangers in the world. This type of fear is what Freud called reality or objective anxiety. Dangerous snakes, dangerous animals, tigers, lions, bears. These pose a real threat to us, and it makes sense that we would be afraid because these animals can kill us, they can eat us. Neurotic anxiety is a fear based on a childhood conflict between the id and the ego, between our basic instincts and the rational part of our personality. Moral anxiety is a little bit different. It is a fear based on the conflict between our instincts, our id, and the moral part of our personality, the superego. According to Freud, anxiety is created by the constant demands and sometimes conflicting demands of the id, the ego, and the superego. When we experience anxiety, Freud proposed that it is a signal to the ego that the personality is being threatened. We can respond to tension in two different ways, using rational responses like running away. We may also respond using non-rational responses. Freud defined defense mechanisms as the non-rational strategies that we sometimes use to defend the ego, to defend ourselves against the anxiety, the fear that is created in daily life. These defense mechanisms, we'll cover several of them on the next few slides. These defense mechanisms all have a few things in common. They all involve distortions of reality. Defense mechanisms work by changing our perception of reality. so that we don't experience or we avoid or we minimize the anxiety that we might experience. All defense mechanisms also operate unconsciously and continuously without our awareness. Defense mechanisms can influence mental health. Relying on them too much can cause different types of neurotic behaviors, the types of behaviors that Freud regularly observed in his own patients. Let's look at a few of the original defense mechanisms that both Sigmund Freud and his daughter Anna Freud studied in the early days. Projection involves attributing a negative or an unpleasant impulse onto other people. For example, I don't hate him, he hates me. In reality, I don't like that person, but I don't want to admit that to myself. Admitting that makes me feel bad. So instead of admitting it, I project that feeling of dislike onto someone else. Denial involves a failure to acknowledge reality as it is. It involves an avoidance of the events or the ideas, the thoughts that cause the anxiety in the first place. For instance, a terminally ill patient may avoid thinking about their impending death as a way to deal with the challenge of knowing that you will not live much longer. Regression involves a retreat to earlier forms of coping, the coping skills that you used in childhood. A preschooler, for instance, acts like and talks like a baby to avoid doing their chores. And I can vouch that preschoolers absolutely do this. They try this quite often. Don't let them get away with it. Repression occurs when we unintentionally remove unwanted thoughts from memory. Some of you may have experienced some traumatic events in your life. I was in a car accident years ago. We repress some of those memories so that we don't have to think about them, so that we don't have to relive the trauma of our lives. You can see how this might be beneficial in some situations. That car accident, I remember very few things about it. I remember spinning around in a circle and landing in a cornfield. Other than that, I don't remember much about what happened. Rationalization involves justification. It involves a reworking of reality so that our behavior appears more rational and acceptable. For example, despite having multiple drinks every night, a person says that they are not an alcoholic because they never drink before 5 p.m. Reaction formation is an interesting defense mechanism. This occurs when an individual expresses a desire or an impulse that is the opposite of the desire, the impulse that they're actually experiencing. For instance, a person who feels threatened by their sexual desires becomes a crusader against pornography. Displacement involves the redirection of an impulse, an instinct, toward a substitute object or person. When we are frustrated with work, sometimes we yell at our friends and our families. It happens. Sublimation also involves a redirection, but this time the instinct, the energy is redirected into channels that are more acceptable. For instance, a graduate student works on their thesis for 14 hours a day while their partner is on an extended business trip. While their partner is gone, they may miss that person, they may want to spend time with that person. That could create some anxiety. Instead of directing that anxiety into a negative activity, that energy is redirected into something that is productive and helps that person get ahead in life. According to Freud, personality development occurs over a series of stages that every single person experiences. Each stage is associated with an erogenous zone of the body, and each stage involves a conflict that must be resolved before the child can move on to the next stage. The gratification of id instincts, those basic hunger, thirst, sex, those basic instincts depend on the stimulation of these zones. If a child does not move through a conflict successfully, fixation occurs. Fixation is, according to Freud, when some energy remains invested in one particular stage due to frustration or over gratification, which then leaves less energy for the child to spend on the stage that they should be in. Fixation is just the idea that we get stuck in a previous stage and can't move forward. Freud proposed 5 psychosexual stages of personality development. He calls them psychosexual because they involved not only personality, but also erogenous zones of the body. In the first stage, the mouth is the primary zone of focus. A child must learn to suck, chew, eat, verbalize their desires, their wants. Successful resolution involves weaning. If a child is not weaned within the first year of life, according to Freud, as an adult, they may grow up to be orally aggressive or orally passive. The second stage is the anal stage. The anus is the primary focus of this particular stage, and it occurs between the ages of 1 and 3. Children must learn to control their bowel and bladder movements. If they are able to do this, great. If not, as adults, Freud said they would become overly tidy or completely disorganized, anal retentive or anal expulsive. The third stage is called the phallic stage. It occurs between the ages of 3 and 6, and one's genitals are the focus in this particular stage. Once a child gets to the genital stage, the very last stage of development, the self's genitals are no longer the focus, it's others' erogenous zones become the focus. In the phallic stage, children must learn to masturbate and identify with the gender assigned to them at birth. Boys in this stage experience what is called the Oedipus complex. Girls experience what Freud called the Electra complex. If a child is unable to identify with the gender assigned to them at birth, they may experience sexual dysfunction and difficulty with intimate relationships as adults. We don't know much about the fourth stage, the latency stage. There is some missing information. This is one of the weaknesses of Freud's theory. The other 4 stages have been explained very well. This 4th stage we don't know much about. The latency stage occurs between the ages of 6 and 12. We don't know the erogenous zone that is associated with this stage. Freud didn't describe one. In this stage, children must deal with the sexual feelings that have been dormant for many years, the sexual feelings that are beginning to surface as they approach adolescence. Successful resolution involves the development of healthy relationships with one's peers. This is also the stage at which children begin to use defense mechanisms. Remember, everyone uses defense mechanisms according to Freud. And so it is during this stage that children begin to learn how to use these defense mechanisms to protect themselves from daily anxiety. Again, we don't know what happens if a child gets fixated on this stage, so we'll move on to the 5th and final stage, the genital stage, which occurs about the time a child reaches adolescence. Children in this stage must learn about reproduction and sexual pleasure. Successful resolution then is the development of intimate and sexual relationships. If adolescents are unable to do this during this stage, then as adults, they may face sexual challenges, impotency, difficulty with intimate relationships. This is one of the more unique aspects of Freud's theory, so bear with me. Freud suggested that young boys have an unconscious sexual desire for their mother. This desire leads little boys to want to replace and even destroy their father. Castration anxiety is the fear that little boys have that their father is going to cut off their penis so that their mother cannot be with them. This is real parts of the theory. Freud proposed that young boys resolve this fear, this complex, by identifying with the father. By identifying with the father, they can then compete for their mother's attention. They cannot destroy their father. They want to, but they can't. So the next best thing is to act like their father in an effort to attract their mother. Something similar happens with little girls, according to Freud. Little girls have what is called an Electra complex. They have an unconscious desire for their father. And again, this desire for their father leads them to want to replace or destroy their mother. Penis envy is the term Freud used to describe little girls' envy of males' body parts. According to Freud, all little girls want a penis, but they can't have a penis, and so it essentially makes them feel bad about themselves. If little girls don't resolve this complex, it can result in a poorly developed superego, in a poorly developed moral system. Now let's talk about Freud's methods. He relied on the case study method. He interviewed his clients about their childhood experiences and about the challenges that they face as adults. Because the theory is based on abnormal personality and because the theory is based on case studies, it has limited application to our lives. On top of that, many of Freud's clients were European, Caucasian, wealthy women. He did not study a wide variety of individuals. Most of the people who came to his clinic in the early 1900s were from one demographic group. In the late 1800s, Freud created the method that he is most famous for. He called it psychoanalysis. It is a kind of talking cure that relies on dialogue between the client and the therapist, the psychoanalyst. The therapist's goal is to reach the patient's unconscious and create free will. Release the person from their unconscious conflicts and allow that person's free will to make choices about their behaviors. So instead of the unconscious ruling a person, the person rules the person. That was the goal of a psychoanalyst. His method impacted the entire field of psychology. Clinical psychology, other fields, our understanding of personality and motivation. To reach the unconscious, Freud used what he called free association. He would ask patients to say whatever came to mind. Some patients, he noticed, had difficulty doing this. They experienced what he called resistances. They were unable to talk about some of their memories because of this blockage. Catharsis is a method in which a patient expresses certain emotions, usually emotions that they would rather not experience and they would rather not talk about. But by expressing these negative emotions, they could reduce the symptoms, the anxiety that they experience on a daily basis. Freud, like other early personality theorists, relied on dream analysis as a way to access his patient's unconscious. He would ask them to describe the things that they dreamed about, the events, the people that were in the dreams, their experience of the dream. These events, the actual content of the dream, he called this the manifest content. He used that content to then infer a symbolic meaning behind those events in one's dream. The symbolic meaning is what he called the latent content of a dream. Describe your dream so that it can be interpreted and we can make assumptions about your personality. Modern research supports Freud's ideas that unconscious forces and childhood experiences shape our adult conscious thoughts and behavior. We do have evidence to support that. We also have evidence that at least 4 of his original defense mechanisms, displacement, repression, denial, and projection, exist. We also know that dreams reflect emotional concerns, but they do not tell us much about your stable pattern of behavior. Freudian slips, the idea that sometimes we, switch 2 words or we mess up a phrase, these casual lapses in speech, they also occur. Modern research does not support Freud's notion that personality develops through 5 stages. It could be 4, it could be 9, it could be 253. 5 stages in that order at those ages, we don't have evidence to support that. Personality is fixed by the age of 5. Freud really believed that personality does not change much after adolescence. Who we are as adults is who we have been since childhood. But modern research has found evidence to suggest that we can change throughout our lives. We can change in adulthood and even older adulthood. Dreams do not represent our unconscious desires or our personality to the degree that Freud first proposed. They tell us about your emotional concerns, but not much else. While Freudian slips exist, they happen. They happen to you, they happen to me. We know they exist, but these lapses in speech should not be used to infer personality traits. One last slide of a few more criticisms of Freud's theory. His methods were subjective. He did not collect data in a systematic fashion. His ideas about the unconscious are difficult to test and difficult to test using the experimental method. His views about women at the time were acceptable, but today are considered controversial and even sexist. His notes, which he jotted down from memory after his meetings with patients, sometimes conflict with his published versions. Typically, during interviews, you want to take notes during the interview. If you wait until after the interview, you might forget some things. Congratulations, you have finished what is probably the most difficult theory to tackle in this class. Now we get to move on to Carl Jung, who knew Freud very well.